Welcome back, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about erosion. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's something that we can see happening all around us. So if you're living your whole life in Pennsylvania, you might never feel an earthquake, but you can see erosion all over the place. And hopefully after this lecture, you will be able to notice erosion more and understand what's going on when you see examples of erosion, like this stream bank that you see here. We have that steep bank that's being eroded by this little stream. You can see some of the grass on top of it is almost ready to fall into the stream because the soil underneath it has been eroded. So we're going to understand why some of these things are occurring. So our goals for this lesson are first for you to be able to explain the process of weathering, erosion, and deposition. So often when we talk about erosion, we're really referring to this whole set of processes: weathering, erosion proper, and deposition. Then we're going to be looking at how streams form and develop over time through processes of erosion and deposition, and to identify and delineate watersheds, which are a key element of how our landscape around us works. So to set the context, the shape of the surface of our Earth that we live on is created by the balance between internal and external forces in the Earth. Right? We've got internal and external forces, and broadly speaking, internal forces build things up. So one of the major internal forces that we've already talked about in this class is plate tectonics. And if you think back to our lessons on plate tectonics, we thought a lot about how things are built up, right? We get colliding tectonic plates and they produce mountain ranges and they produce volcanoes and lift things up into the air. So we've got these internal forces building things up. Then we've got external forces that tend to wear things down. They tend to take all those things that were built up through plate tectonics and push them down, smooth them out, return them back to a more level situation. So these external forces are things like wind, rain, snow, heating and cooling of the Earth. And the external forces work through this three-stage process of weathering, erosion, and deposition. So it's one of the key things that you want to remember: weathering, erosion, deposition. So let's look at each of those three stages of these external forces wearing things down on the surface of the Earth. So the first step, weathering, is the breakup of solid material. Right, so we've got stuff that is solid. That's how it's staying in position. And the first thing that has to happen for these external forces to change it is for it to get broken up. So it's vulnerable to being moved around. And there are three main types of weathering, three main ways that weathering occurs. So first we have mechanical weathering. So this is weathering that occurs through the application of physical force, or applying force to something like this gravestone that you see here, right? This gravestone's been heavily weathered. You can see how difficult it is to read the writing or recognize the art that's on this stone, that if you squint there, you can see the person died in 1888, right? So it's been getting weathered for almost a century and a half there. So mechanical weathering, application of physical force. So this can be the motion of water, air, or sediment over our thing that's being weathered. So we've got water running across it. This is going to apply force to it and break it up, or air going across it. And either of those things can be amplified if they're carrying sediment along with them. If there's some sort of grit or, solid material that's getting scraped across something else, that's going to cause weathering. Another major form of mechanical weathering is expansion and contraction from heating and cooling. Any solid object is going to expand a little bit when it gets warmer, and it's going to contract a little bit when it gets colder. And in many places on the surface of the Earth, we have quite big temperature differences that things are going to be exposed to over the course of the year, even over the course of a week or a day. You might get very significant changes in temperature. And all of that expanding and contracting can eventually break things down. They can't handle all of that repeated stress of the temperature changes, and they'll start to break down. So that's another kind of mechanical weathering. And then we also have what's called frost wedging. So one of the unusual things about water is that it actually expands when it freezes. So that initial freezing of water, it expands, right? That's why if you put a can of Coke in the freezer to try to cool it down, got to keep an eye on it, because if it totally freezes into ice, it's going to explode your can in your freezer. So if you have water that gets down into, say, some rock, and then it freezes and it expands, that is going to exert force on that rock from inside. The water that has soaked into it is going to push on it from inside, and that can cause that rock to break down, to crack. So another important type of mechanical weathering in areas where it regularly gets below freezing temperature, such as here in Pennsylvania. Second type of weathering is chemical weathering. So with chemical weathering, your thing that's being weathered undergoes a chemical reaction that weakens the material. So for example, water as it exists in our environment, normal rainwater, stream water, etc., is usually slightly acidic. And so that acidity is due to various other chemicals that are dissolved in that water, right? It's not pure H2O, it's got other things in it. And those acids will have chemical reactions with the chemicals that make up the structure of a rock, and that can break down those minerals in the rock. And this kind of chemical weathering can be enhanced by pollution. So normal rainwater is very slightly acidic, but of course we sometimes get acid rain when, say, industrial pollution has put a bunch of additional acidic materials into our atmosphere that get caught in our rainwater, wash across things as the rain falls, or as streams that pick up that water carry that along, and so that's going to enhance that chemical weathering. So chemical weathering, we have a chemical reaction that's actually changing the molecular structure of our rock or other material. And then our third type of weathering is biological weathering. So it's the action of living organisms. So that can occur in a number of different ways. So you've got roots from plants that get into little cracks in rocks and things. And then as they grow, they can break those apart. So this gravestone doesn't have too much on it that you can really see, but if you see other ones that have like moss and lichens growing on them, those are undergoing biological weathering from the roots of those the moss and the lichens, and everything up to big trees can do it too with their roots. You've also got burrowing by animals that can take, usually animals don't burrow into like a solid rock, but if you've got some soil, for example, is very compact, staying in place, it can get broken up if you've got worms or gophers or woodchucks or whatever that's burrowing into that, can break that soil up and cause weathering. You've also got traffic by humans and animals walking across the surface. So every time you step on the ground, your foot is disturbing the soil that you are stepping on, and that can create weathering if there's a place that people walk a lot or a place that animals walk across a lot. And in fact, there's a big push right now in Australia to shift from cattle ranching to kangaroo ranching. And among the reasons that some people are wanting to make this shift is because cattle hooves have a higher weathering impact, because cattle hooves are small and hard, and so they break up the soil more so than kangaroo feet, which are big and soft. And this is a major problem in the rangelands of Australia, that there is weathering and then erosion that happens as a result of having all these cattle there. And so some people are pushing to switch more people over from cattle to kangaroos because they want to reduce this biological weathering impact on these soils. Okay, so once things are broken up through weathering, then we can have erosion. So strictly speaking, erosion is the transportation of weathered material away from its place of origin. So you have a rock and it's broken up by mechanical, chemical, or biological agents. Then erosion takes that weathered rock and moves it somewhere else. And so the major agents of erosion are water, air, and gravity. So you have water flowing across the surface of the earth will pick up materials and move them. Air blowing across the land can erode things, can move weathered materials. And if you have any sort of a slope, gravity is going to make things want to fall down that slope. And so if they become sufficiently weathered, sufficiently unanchored from their place of origin, then gravity can make them just kind of roll down the hill. So a few examples of forms that we see erosion take. First is what's called creep or hillside creep, where the material on the surface of a hillside slowly shifts downhill. And one of the major ways that you can notice creep is through things like you see in the picture on the slide there. See, there's that fence in the foreground, and that fence is leaning way to the side. That fence wasn't built like that, right? Whoever built that fence put the fence posts in straight up and down. But over time, the soil that the fence posts are in has been creeping down that hillside, right? That's a pretty steep hillside you're on there. And as the soil has creeped down, it has tilted those fence posts over. So if you ever look at a hillside, if there is old infrastructure there, if there are fence posts, telephone poles, light posts, anything like that, you can assume that it was probably installed straight up and down. So if it is now leaning downhill, like we see with that fence, that's good evidence that creep is happening on that location and nobody's come along to fix that, right? Ideally, somebody should come along and fix that fence, reset the posts to be straight up and down. But for now, we can see them as evidence of creep. You can also see this with trees, and trees make an interesting case. And you can kind of actually see it with those two trees in the background of that picture if you look really closely, because trees, they want to grow up and down. And so if creep is tilting those trees over in the same way that the fence posts are, the tree will try to correct for it, right? Because the fence post is dead. It's just going to move if the soil that it's in moves. The tree is going to try to grow straight again. And so on a hillside, you often see trees that have kind of a J-shaped bottom to them. So they grow kind of sideways out of the hill and then curve upward. And that's often due to creep, that the tree was tilted over and then it corrected course and shifted to growing straight up and down again. And then it tilted over some more and it corrected course to grow upright again. And so you get this curved bottom to your tree on a slope because the tree is trying to compensate for this creep on the slope. So creep is a slow shifting of the surface of a hill downward. Then you have mass wasting, which is sort of a broad term for things like landslides where there's a sudden shift of material downhill. So rather than occurring, so slow that you can't directly watch it happen, it will happen all of a sudden. And this may be simply because that material has, kind of crossed a tipping point and has gotten just a little bit too unstable and it starts to collapse and it brings a bunch of other stuff down with it. Or there may be some sort of a triggering event. So an earthquake can trigger a landslide if there is stuff that's kind of in a fragile pile, essentially, and it gets shaken by the earthquake. That can destabilize it and lead to a lot of material coming down the hill. Large amounts of rain can cause mass wasting because the rainwater soaks into your soil and essentially lubricates it. And so it loses the friction that may have been keeping it in place, and then it slides down the hill. So you're dealing with mass wasting when you have a large, sudden movement of material downhill. Another common form we see erosion taking is gullying. So when you have these sharp little valleys that are carved out by water flowing across a surface, and it just tears through the soil and leaves this sharp little valley or gully. Then there's also often erosion that we don't easily see, that you have little bits of material being taken off from across the whole surface of a landscape, and it may be hard to notice it directly unless we're like measuring soil depth over the course of decades and seeing that go down. So then some of the hazards that erosion can pose to people are, first, there's direct destruction of life or property, especially in, say, a mass wasting event where you get lots of stuff very suddenly goes down the hill. If you're standing in the way of that, you might be in big trouble. It can, tear down houses and everything else, right? So a very sudden erosion event can obviously kill people, destroy a lot of property. You also have the loss of good soil. So as erosion is moving stuff away, it may be taking away soil from farmland. Then that makes those farmlands less productive. That's not good for us if we depend on the food that's being grown on those farmlands. And erosion can also cause pollution of waterways, because as material is moved away, it often ends up in our waterways. Water is transporting that sediment away from the site where it weathered, and having lots of sediment in that water, especially if it includes harmful types of materials that may have eroded off of the land, that's not good to have in our water. Then the third stage of this process is deposition. So you've got all of this weathered material, erosion moved it out of place, it's now being carried along by some sort of force of gravity or water or something, but it's got to go somewhere, it's got to end up somewhere in the end. So deposition is this material is now placed down in another place. And so it's important to remember that erosion and deposition always go together. You can't have erosion without deposition and vice versa, right? There's nothing to deposit if nothing has eroded, but once things erode, they got to go somewhere. They got to get deposited somewhere. Right? So these two things always go together. The sediment that's being moved has to start by getting eroded and by getting deposited. And if we look at some sort of landscape, we can divide it up into what we call erosional and depositional environments, depending on which of those parts of this process is dominant in a particular location. So we can point out certain areas where you have mostly erosion happening, we call that an erosional environment, and other places where you have mostly deposition occurring, that's a depositional environment. So that's one way of understanding how these processes, these external forces are reshaping our landscape, is to say, where do we have erosional landscapes? Where do we have depositional landscapes? Right? Where is material being removed? Where is it being placed down? And deposition is essential to human life. We depend on deposition occurring. So one of the clearest ways is that all of our fertile farmland, right, everywhere we're growing all of the food that we eat, is in depositional environments. It's deposition that builds up the soil that we're growing all of our crops in. And different areas are have different kinds of deposition that has built up that soil, but to get good rich farmland, you need deposition occurring. So deposition is in many ways a very good thing for us. But on the other hand, too much deposition in the wrong places can also be a hazard. So if you're getting a lot of deposition in a particular spot, that could bury your infrastructure, right? It could bury houses and roads and so forth that we depend on. It can also block navigation. So if you've got a river or a channel that's important for shipping, and it becomes a more depositional environment than you expected, and it starts to fill up with sediment, then it might get too shallow. You can't drive your boats through there, and you might have to do something to fix that, like dredge out the riverbed to be able to actually go through there. So deposition is essential, but also too much deposition or deposition in the wrong place can be a problem for people as well. And as an illustration of a depositional environment, I've got there two different satellite images of the Mississippi River Delta. So this is the very end of the Mississippi River down in Louisiana. And this area is formed by deposition. So you can see the river running through the center there, and then all the green to either side is land that's created by deposition of sediment that is coming down the Mississippi River, things that have been eroded all throughout the middle of the United States. The whole watershed of the Mississippi gets brought down and deposited near the mouth of Mississippi here, and it builds up land there. And if you compare those two satellite images, the upper one is from 1976, lower one is from 2001, you can see changes in the land. You can see land growing in some areas where we have a strong depositional environment. It's marked as new land on the lower picture there. Whereas in other places, we have erosion happening, where the deposition isn't keeping up with erosional forces. And so you see retreating shoreline and inundations. That means that the ocean is encroaching because the erosion caused by the ocean water is taking away sediment faster than the river is depositing more there. So one of the main places that we see these processes of erosion and deposition occurring in our landscape around us is in streams. So stream here referring to all sizes of water courses, right? From a very tiny little trickle up to a very large river. We'll just call them all streams for convenience. And the first key thing to remember about streams is that water flows downhill. Right? Water moves because of gravity. So once it has fallen as precipitation, it's in liquid form on the surface of the earth, it's going to go downhill. And it can flow downhill in three different ways. So it can flow simply across the surface of the land. Right? So overland flow is just flowing across the surface of the land. It can also flow in stream channels. If you get enough water together, it's going to start eroding out a channel for itself. It's going to start creating a defined place to flow in instead of just broadly across the whole land. So we get stream channels forming on the surface. And we also have underground flow. So as some of that precipitation soaks into the ground, it's going to continue to go downhill, but underground. And so usually above ground streams are accompanied by underground flow of water as well. So that's harder to see, but also essential. You may have a well that taps into that underground water, for example. And these streams are fed by precipitation, as I mentioned. So we get new water falling onto the ground through rain events. We also have snow and ice melt. So there may be snow and ice that is sitting on the ground, and as it starts to melt, then that meltwater is going to flow into streams. And groundwater can feed into streams. So that water that's flowing underground can reemerge to the surface depending on the slope of the land you're dealing with and the porousness of the various materials underground and so forth. Various things can cause that groundwater to flow out onto the surface and feed into our surface streams. And as our streams flow downhill, they'll often join together. And so when one stream flows into another, we call it a tributary. So it is adding water to the main stream. And usually we talk about, whichever one is larger is kind of the main stream, the other one flowing into it, it's a tributary, but sometimes it's, it's not obvious or very super clear which one should count as the main stream and which is the tributary. But, that's just kind of a linguistic thing. So streams often join together as they flow downhill, but it's much rarer for them to split apart, right? For an existing stream to divide into two streams. You usually only see that when the land is extremely flat. So like at the end of a river, if you remember the Mississippi Delta that we saw on the last slide, right, that the river split up into a bunch of distributaries, which is what we call the resulting streams when a stream splits up, split into a bunch of little distributaries, but only right near the end of the stream. So that's a fairly rare occurrence that a stream will split apart. Usually it's coming together. And that's one thing that can help you figure out which way a stream is flowing if you're looking at, say, a map that's got some water courses marked on it, but if you, for example, don't have elevation marked, you're trying to figure out which way the stream is going, remember that if you've got streams connected to each other, they're probably flowing together rather than splitting apart. So when we look at a particular stream, we often talk about its watershed. So a watershed is an area of land that drains to a particular outflow point. And often we talk the outflow point is either where that stream enters a larger body of water, like a lake or an ocean, or where that stream enters another stream. So the confluence of one stream with another, and then we look upstream of that, and that's that stream's watershed. Another way to think about watersheds is to ask, if a drop of water fell on a certain point on the earth, and it starts flowing downhill, where would it flow to? What stream would it end up in? Then that point where that water fell is the watershed of that stream. So all the areas where water that fell on those areas would flow into the same stream and end up at that same outflow point, that constitutes the watershed. Watersheds are separated by drainage divides. So these are the high point that separates two watersheds. So a drainage divide is always going to be higher in elevation than the watersheds to either side, because what you're essentially saying is that water that falls to one side of that drainage divide will flow into one stream. Water that falls to the other side of that drainage divide will flow into a different stream. So the drainage divide is going to be at the high point, like along the ridge of a hill or a mountain. And then water flows in different directions on either side of that drainage divide. So you've got two different watersheds there. And then the third point that I want to make here is that watersheds are nested. So a large watershed is made up of smaller watersheds for all of the tributaries. So on the diagram here, right, the dotted red line shows the boundary of the watershed of this stream that we're seeing here. All of the water that falls on the ground within that dotted red line eventually flows out at the bottom of the diagram there where it says to the bay. But we could subdivide that. Right, so you can see that that ridge has these little, sub-ridges coming in, and then there are all those little tributaries. So each of those little tributaries has their own watershed that makes up part of the larger watershed of the main stream. So here's an illustration for us at Slippery Rock. So the red star on the map there is the location of Slippery Rock University. And if you look at a map, you'll see that the university and the town of Slippery Rock lie right in between Wolf Creek and the upper portion of Slippery Rock Creek. So the portion of Slippery Rock Creek upstream of where it joins with Wolf Creek. Right? So Wolf Creek is a tributary of Slippery Rock Creek. And so the university and the town lie essentially along the drainage divide between Wolf Creek and Upper Slippery Rock Creek. And one of the things you'll be doing in your exercise for this week is looking at, well, where exactly is that watershed boundary? Right? If you were to go somewhere on campus or in town and pour some water in the ground, would that water flow to Wolf Creek or would it flow to the upper part of Slippery Rock Creek? And the answer is going to depend on exactly where you are. Some places in the Slippery Rock area, it would flow one direction, some would flow the other, because we've got that drainage divide running right through the community. So as I said, Wolf Creek is a tributary of Slippery Rock Creek. And it's small enough that it's not shown on this particular map there. But then Slippery Rock Creek is a tributary of Connoquenessing Creek, which is in turn a tributary of the Beaver River, which flows into the Ohio River, which then flows into the Mississippi River, which flows into the Gulf of Mexico. So regardless of whether it goes to Wolf Creek or Upper Slippery Rock Creek, any water that falls on the ground here in Slippery Rock is going to eventually make its way down to the Connoquenessing, to the Beaver, to the Ohio, to the Mississippi, and then out through the Mississippi Delta that we saw a few slides ago. That's the ultimate destination of any water that falls on the ground in Slippery Rock. So I know some of you, listening to this, aren't in Slippery Rock right now. You might be taking the online course because you're like student teaching in another community or something like that. And even if you're in town right now watching this, you might have a home, your parents' house or whatever, that is not in Slippery Rock. And I would encourage you, this isn't like an assignment or anything, but I would encourage you, as just a way of understanding your place in the natural world, to try to figure out what watersheds you are a part of in wherever else it is that you live. So think about, if you were to pour some water on the ground outside your house, where would it go? If you go directly downhill, the fastest path downhill from where your house is, what stream do you get to? You're in that stream's watershed. Then follow that stream downstream. All right, and you can maybe get a Google Maps or something, has very detailed information on all the streams. Right, you can find that stream, follow it downhill, see what that feeds into, etc., and try to see where does your water end up, and therefore what watersheds are you a part of wherever it is that you're living that's not Slippery Rock. Okay, so I want to take a look at how we might use a topo map to understand where the boundaries of a watershed lie. So this is a section of a topo map of the area around Warren, Pennsylvania. So that's up north of Slippery Rock, up along the Allegheny River. So that's what you see flowing through the southern bit of what I've got here is the Allegheny River. And I want to focus on a smaller stream than that. So if you look right in the center of the image here, you'll see Morse Run, and it flows down into the little community of Starbrick and Jackson Crossing there towards the bottom of the map. I think you can see my cursor. We've got Morse Run here flowing down towards Starbrick. So we could define what is the watershed for Morse Run. And the watershed of Morse Run is going to include the watersheds of the two little unnamed tributaries that are on this map. So you'll see that, just a little north of where the word Starbrick is, we have this tributary that is coming in from the east, and then a little farther up between the words Morse and Run, we've got another little tributary coming in from the west, right? So each of those little tributaries has their own very small watershed that's going to be part of the larger watershed of Morse Run, and then of course the Morse Run watershed is going to be part of the much larger watershed of the Allegheny River. But if we're looking just at Morse Run, what we want to do is we want to think about what areas that water might fall would flow into Morse Run. So if we look, for example, at Yankee Bush Hill here, this ridge that is to the north of Morse Run. So if our water were to fall, on the southern side of Yankee Bush Hill, and it goes downhill, the fastest path downhill leads us to Morse Run. Going across those contour lines, downhill on the southern side of Yankee Bush Hill, it goes into Morse Run. So the southern side of Yankee Bush Hill is part of the Morse Run watershed. On the other hand, if we imagine water falling on the north side of Yankee Bush Hill, so just to the north of where the label is there, the fastest path downhill for that water is going to be to continue northward into Jackson Run. Right? It's going to try to go downhill. It can't go uphill to get across the top of Yankee Bush Hill. It's going to go down into Jackson Run. Jackson Run is not a tributary of Morse Run. It flows into the river at a different spot. So we can say Yankee Bush Hill is part of the drainage divide between the Morse Run watershed and the Jackson Run watershed. And we could continue to try to follow the top of the ridge around and see where is water flowing into Morse Run, where is it flowing into a neighboring stream. So if we come around to the west side of Morse Run, we see Scott Run over there, the next little stream, and we can see that there's this high point in between Morse Run and Scott Run. And so if we look at that, we can see that more or less runs north and south. And if water were to fall on the east side of that ridge, it would flow downhill into Morse Run, possibly into this little tributary first, but then on into Morse Run. On the other hand, if water fell on the west side of this ridge, the fastest route downhill would be to go down into Scott Run. So this unnamed ridge here is also part of the drainage divide that separates the Morse Run watershed from the other watersheds around it. So we could continue that process. Oh, I got some arrows there illustrating that water flow. And there we go. There is the boundary of our watershed for Morse Run. So it's following the highest point of the land all around Morse Run. And so anything within that red line, water that fell there, its fastest path downhill would be to flow into Morse Run. But if it fell outside of that red line, its fastest path downhill would take it into a different stream. And one thing you'll notice here is that the boundary of that Morse Run watershed, for a lot of its distance, it's more or less following some roads, right? Those dark gray lines are roads there. And that's actually a common thing in Western Pennsylvania because our landscape is a big plateau. We have a big kind of flat piece of land that was pushed up by tectonic forces. As the Appalachian Mountains were created, it pushed up this big flat piece of land that's the Allegheny Plateau. But then erosion has cut valleys into that. So the tops of our mountains and hills here in Western Pennsylvania are largely the remnants of the top of that plateau. So that tends to be a nice kind of flat spot to put a road. So you often see roads following the ridge tops in western Pennsylvania because of how our landscape formed, through the uplift of this big flat plateau and then cutting it up with erosion of these various streams, creating these little valleys in it. So let's look at the formation of valleys. Valleys are created by erosion that is carried out by water flowing in a stream. And the amount of erosion that a stream is going to do is a function of the energy that that stream has. So connecting all the way back to some of the stuff you learned from your physics lessons, that water has energy, and that energy is going to allow it to engage in erosion. And the steeper a stream is, the more energy its water has. So if it is coming down a steep slope, it's going to come down really fast, it's going to have a lot of energy, and so it's going to do a lot of erosion. But then if it's on a more level slope, it's not going downhill as much, it's going to be a slower stream, it's going to have less energy, and it's going to erode less. So a high energy stream is going to cut a deep V-shaped kind of valley, like you see with letter A on the diagram here. When you have a low energy stream, it's flowing on a very flat surface, not going so fast, you're going to get a broad U-shaped kind of valley. And typically, streams will start out near their headwaters, very steep, lots of energy, and as they go downward, they will start to level out and become lower energy, slower moving as they get towards their mouth, where they either feed into another stream or into a lake or ocean. And the higher the energy that the stream has, the more material it can carry along with it. So a stream that is very high energy, high slope, is going to erode a lot of stuff, and it's going to carry that stuff along. It's going to drag lots of material, just a large volume of material, and large chunks of material along with it. But as it slows down, as it levels out, as it loses energy, it's going to start to deposit that material. It's not going to have the energy to carry stuff along with it. And so instead of erosion, it's going to start doing deposition. It's going to start dropping things off as it goes. So upper portions of streams, where the stream is steep and fast, tend to be erosional environments. The lower portions of streams, where the stream is flowing at a shallow slope, slower, less energy, tend to be depositional environments. But we can slice it even finer than that, because streams will reshape their course as they go through a balance of different forms of erosion and deposition. And one of the characteristic forms this takes is something called meanders. So if you've looked at a river on a map, you may have seen the river doesn't just flow relatively straight. It often zigzags back and forth, and it makes these kind of rounded loops as it goes. We call these loops meanders. And rivers are constantly forming and eliminating meanders. It's a dynamic process. It's changing all the time because of erosion and deposition. So as our stream goes, it's going to have some sort of little twists in it. Even if it's just the water kind of bouncing back from one side of the banks of the river to the other, even just a little bit is enough to get a meander started. And so as that water hits the outside of that curve, it's hitting that area with more energy. And so it's going to create erosion on the outer bank of the meander. So you can see that near the top of this diagram here. You're going to get erosion on the outside bank of that meander. And if we were standing there by this river, we would see a steep slope there where it's been eroded into the land there. So you're getting erosion happening on the outside of that meander. Meanwhile, the river has a lot less energy on the inside of the meander, and so you're going to get deposition happening there. You're going to get material being dropped off on the inside of that meander. So you're going to form this kind of flat tongue of land, known as a point bar, that's going to stick out into the middle part of that meander. And since you've got erosion happening on the outside of the meander and deposition happening on the inside of the meander is going to get bigger and bigger over time. And it's going to stick out farther and farther into the land as it goes, because it keeps eroding farther into the outside bank and then depositing material to create a point bar to fill in the inside of that meander. So the meanders get bigger and bigger over time. They also tend to move downstream because that erosion is also happening a little bit more on the downstream side of the meander than the upstream side, because that's where the water is basically whacking into as it comes around the curve there. So meanders get bigger and bigger over time. But eventually, the river may break through the neck of that point bar. So where instead of going all the way around the meander, it's going to cut through and straighten itself out. This often happens during a flooding event. If the water level gets really high, it overwhelms that point bar, which is, it's a depositional feature. It's very low profile. And so the flood water has so much energy, it can't get around the meander, and it's just going to overcome that, and it's going to cut through that neck and straighten the river out. And it's going to leave that meander kind of stranded. We call that stranded meander an oxbow lake. So we've got this part of the riverbed that is now cut off because the river has cut across, straightened itself out. We've got this little piece left behind there. And that oxbow lake, because it's no longer receiving water's not flowing through it, is going to slowly start to fill in. Various stuff is going to wash into there over time. It's going to fill in with sediment, with plant material that grows in there. It's going to eventually turn into a wetland, like a marsh or a swamp, and then eventually fill into a solid land. Meanwhile, new meanders are going to form over time. So this process of creating meanders is a dynamic one. It's constantly changing. Meanders are constantly growing and then getting cut off to straighten the river back out, and then new meanders growing. So we can actually see this process happening in some streams in our area. So this is a image with the hill shading terrain turned on so that you can kind of see the shape of the land a little better of Connoquenessing Creek near the town of Connoquenessing in the middle of Butler County. And so you see two big meanders there kind of facing northward, and then a southward facing one in between them in what I've cropped out for you. And so you'll notice, especially with the two northward facing ones, that the hill slope is very steep around the outside of those meanders. Those meanders are cutting into the hill there, eroding, and leaving that kind of steep slope because they'll erode at the bottom of it, and then the top of the slope will kind of fall in and leave about as steep a slope as will stay stable in that location. So, and then on the inside of the meander, you've got that point bar forming. You can see this is low, flat land forming the inside part of those meanders. So the two ones that kind of loop northward are very clear illustrations of this process that I was talking about. The one kind of looping southward shows us a meander that has been cut off. So you can see there the hillside that has that kind of curved shape to it that's very similar to the curved shapes on the outsides of the meanders that face northward. But the stream doesn't go along the hillside there. It cuts across farther to the north. But you can also see there are a few little cut off bits of water there. So what has happened there, so this is just south of where the Wallville label is on this map. What's happened there is that meander used to go all the way down to that steep hillside. It was eroding into that hillside. It was increasing the size of the meander, but then the stream cut through the neck of the point bar, straightened itself out, and so now it flows more directly. It skips the outside of that meander, and so now bits of that old meander are left behind as oxbow lakes. Those are the three little cut-off bodies of water that you can see there, and the stream is now flowing more directly across the neck of what used to be the old point bar there. Over time, we may see that happen with those other two meanders. The river might, for example, cut across kind of maybe just north of where the Wallville label is, right, and straighten out that meander and leave behind that point bar kind of on the other side with a little oxbow lake up near where the bridge currently crosses the creek. So we can see these meanders forming and reshaping watercourses even right here in Butler County. Now those changes are fairly small ones. Connoquenessing is not a huge creek. But we can also see those changes happening in much bigger rivers like the Mississippi. And these changes can create complications for people because, as I said the other week, people, especially in industrial societies, like our landscape to stay stable. We want it to stay the same, but nature doesn't like to stay the same. Nature likes to constantly be changing things, and so that creates problems for us when things change. So here you have a portion of the border between the states of Tennessee and Arkansas. And when these states were first established, they established that the border would be along the Mississippi River. But over time, the course of the Mississippi has changed. And in this particular section, we see the Mississippi having cut off a number of old meanders. And when that happened, the states of Arkansas and Tennessee agreed to keep their border at the same location, keep their border where the Mississippi River was back when the states were created, even though the river no longer follows that line anymore. And so you can see that there's a little chunk on the chunk of Arkansas that's now on the Tennessee side of the river, just above where it says Lower Hatchie National Wildlife Refuge. And then south of there, 3 sections of Tennessee that are now on the Arkansas side of the river, because the border is showing you where meanders used to exist. And you can even in some of them see the oxbow lakes that were left behind by the former course of the river, but the river has cut off those meanders and straightened out its course in this particular location. Over time, it will start to develop new meanders. And so the river might cut into one or the other of those states and leave part of it stranded on the opposite side of the river by a new meander. And in this case, Arkansas and Tennessee were able to kind of work this out because, they're friendly states. They're parts of the same overall country. This gets even more complicated when that river is an international border. And we actually see this same process happening with the Rio Grande that forms the border between the United States and Mexico. It has meanders in it, and those meanders want to shift over time. That's just the process that happens with rivers, that you get this erosion and deposition happening, and it all makes meanders grow and eventually cut themselves off over time. But that's a complicated thing when you're using that river as the border between two countries, and where you're trying to really control commerce and immigration and stuff going across that border. And so the United States has put a lot of effort into trying to stabilize the Rio Grande, to try to prevent it from shifting its course so that it doesn't complicate the border with Mexico. So what can we do to prevent erosion? If we want to stop these various hazards that occur from erosion, loss of topsoil, changing river courses that mess up boundaries, etc., what can we do? And there's a number of things that we can do to prevent erosion. So one very simple thing is simply to maintain plant cover. When we have plants growing on the surface of the land, they tend to inhibit erosion. The roots of the plants hold soil together so that it doesn't as easily get eroded away. The leaves of the plants will reduce wind speeds, so the wind doesn't have as much energy to erode the soil, and they will shelter the soil from the impact of rain, so sapping some of the energy by which rain might contribute to erosion. So maintaining plant cover is a really crucial way that we can reduce erosion. We can also try to harden slopes so that they can't be eroded as easily. So you can see a couple different illustrations of that in the picture there. So you can put up concrete walls like you see where the stream goes under the bridge there. You can also put big chunks of stone on the slope, and the term for that is riprap. So when you see the bank of a stream or another hillside that is covered in these big broken chunks of stone, that's something that has been put there deliberately to try to inhibit erosion, because those big chunks of stone aren't going to erode as easily as just soil would. So that riprap is stabilizing that hill slope and inhibiting erosion there. We can also try to divert water. So if we have water flowing across an area of land that is likely to cause erosion, we can try to divert that water. We can shift that water somewhere else. We can break up its flow. We can slow its flow down so that it has less energy to engage in erosion there. We can also, if we have things that we're doing to the surface of the land that might cause erosion, we can do them in ways that follow the contour lines of the hill slope and therefore don't contribute to erosion. So if you are plowing a field, for example, if you were to plow a field like just straight up and down the hillside, that plowing would really encourage erosion. The water would flow right down those furrows that your plow made and carry your soil away. So you often see farmers plowing with the contour line. So if you remember, a contour line is a line that follows points of the same elevation. So if you follow that contour line, you're staying at the same elevation. You're not going up or down the hill. So if your plow follows the contour lines, stays at the same elevation and loops around the hills on your farmland, then that will inhibit that erosion because your disturbance to the soil is going perpendicular across the direction that erosion wants to move things. And then with paths, you see that as well, especially like a dirt path where human foot traffic can contribute to erosion. Paths will be built to follow contour lines, because if you have a path that goes up and down the slope of a hill, that's going to encourage erosion to happen there, and so that's going to cause erosion. It's also probably going to cause gullying in your path, which makes your path less useful for anybody walking there. So you'll often find paths, especially things like hiking trails that don't have a hard surface, following contour lines rather than running up and down slopes as a way of inhibiting erosion. And then finally, you can simply replenish the soil. So if an area is getting eroded, you can find some soil somewhere else. You can go to a depositional environment, dig it up, and put it back in the area that's getting eroded. So one major area where we see that being done is on beaches. So some beaches are experiencing significant erosion from the action of the ocean. The waves in the ocean can cause erosion. And if that's an important beach, it's a major place that people go for recreation and stuff, or if the beach is important for protecting the homes that are inland of it from storms and tidal surges and stuff that might come in off the ocean, then there are large-scale projects to dig up sand from elsewhere and go replenish that beach and put more sand down onto that beach to make up for what has been eroded. So that's essentially artificial deposition that we can engage in to offset erosion. So these are a number of things that we can do if erosion is a problem for us in a particular place to try to inhibit, slow down, or even stop that erosion. So in your lab assignment, you're going to be using some topo maps to identify watersheds. You're going to be thinking about the effects of erosion and deposition in those areas and drawing some conclusions about the potential erosion-related hazards that different places might experience.